record. Here we go. So I'm very happy to introduce Professor Isabella Lazzarini, who's currently at the University of Molise, but in January will be full professor in the Department of Historical Study at the University of Torino, which sounds like a really exciting move. And among her many past publications, I will mention 3, and I'm also putting the links in the chat in case you want to follow up. So her 2015 book, Communication and Conflict, Italian Diplomacy in the Early Renaissance, 1350 to 1520, has quickly become the new reference standard in the field of Italian diplomacy, drawing on a wide variety of sources to explain how Italian diplomacy led to new modes of political thinking throughout Europe. She's also edited the volume on the later Middle Ages in Oxford's Short History of Europe series, which was out in 2021. And in the same year, her book on Italian chanceries and records, L'ordine della scrittura, il linguaggio documentario del potere nell'Italia tardio medievale came out, which is also a great book. So I recommend all of those. And she's currently working on 3 projects. The first, a forthcoming edited volume about peacemaking and diplomacy with Diego Perillo and Luciano Pifanelli, which is tentatively entitled Reframing Treaties, Peacemaking, and the Political Grammar of Agreements in the Medieval and Early Modern West. Then there's also a joint project on Mediterranean diplomacy, which looks really exciting. I'll put the link to that in the chat as well, just because I think it's a great website and it looks like a really great project. It's looking at the relationships between the Crown of Aragon and the Italian polities with the Mamluk Sultanate, and it's a multi-site project with Liège, Antwerp, and Barcelona. And then the third project she's working on, and what we will hear about today, is on women's roles in building the Italian late medieval principalities. The provisional title in Italian is Dalle parti delle signore, autorità, potere e governo nell'Italia delle signorie, which is where her talk today, entitled Beyond the Renaissance, Female Wealth, Authority, and Political Power in Northern Italy, is coming from. So Isabella, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Monique. And first of all, I would really like to thank you, the 3 of you, for giving me the opportunity to discuss this project, because I have this book in my mind, have worked on it consistently over the years, but it is not on paper yet. So what I would like to do today is try to figure out with you what I'm trying to do, and gather observations, comments, objections, any kind of discussion that can help me to find the time to write it down in a proper way. So, and if I'm too long, you stop me. That's for sure. Thank you. So, I will start from Dante Alighieri. It has been his centennial last year, and we were submerged by Dante 2 years ago, actually. In a famous passage of the Convivio, Dante wrote that he was addressing a geographically dispersed but socially characterized audience, principi, baroni, cavalieri e molt'altra nobile gente, non solamente maschi ma femmine, che sono molti e molte in questa lingua, volgari et non litterati. Noble people, therefore, not literate, so not educated in Latin, but able to read the vernacular, and not just men, but women, and many women. Well, my work is dedicated to these many women, that is, to the female side of the coin of that composite and numerous group of lineages, la nobile gente, who between the 14th and 15th centuries enjoyed a central position in the construction of seigneurial power in central northern Italy, that is, the Italy composed by the communal cities and the empire, subjected to the authority of the empire, of course, to use a couple of good old names. So Lombardy, Veneto, the Po Plain, Emilia-Romagna, and Tuscany, more or less. The history of these women and their role in late medieval and early Renaissance story of a princely power in Italy must be reconsidered, or to be honest, considered tout court as a whole, because we don't have any synthesis on this. so that research can break free from the cultural conditioning sedimented over at least a couple of centuries, the 19th and 20th centuries, of narrative and scientific reconstruction of the exceptional nature of female power in medieval Italian political society. In order to return all those ladies and princesses to their place and role in the history of princely power, it is necessary, however, to do something deeper than just to add a bunch of them, a bunch of names, of stories, of lives to the general frame. I would like to start with three precisions that can help to understand what I mean. The control of huge wealth, landed or mobile or both, the definition of seigniorial authority, the construction, reinforcement, and use of the power to decide, to judge, to order, and finally, the ability to translate this empowered authority into the day-to-day governance of complex and territorial political societies compose a picture of power at a specific stage of its historical trajectory. So we are in Italy, 14th, 15th century. That's politics, the Italian politics of that part, that region of the peninsula. Such power was built, however, using both men's and women's initiative in different but equally crucial ways. A careful study of the role played by the signore in late medieval Italy reveals the traits and mechanisms of what was born and structured as a shared authority. Due to its only partially legitimate origin, these were dynasties without any original title of dominion over the cities from which they emerged, and its inchoative nature. These were political systems far removed from the solidity and awareness of monarchical or imperial regimes. Secondly, what one wants and can do is a political history of this. A political history in the sense that what is needed is to systematically take into account the complementarity of male and female roles, but not just in social and economic history, the history of spirituality, of cultural patronage, that are all very important aspects and features of this power, but also of sheer politics. If this term is declined in the sense of a history of power that in this century at least was both institutionalized and personal, patrimonial and cultural, individual and familial, single and collective. In this broad and flexible sense of political power, women had room to maneuver in emergency as well as in normal times, both through institutional roles and informal functions. Gentlewomen, ladies, princesses were educated to embody roles and manage space, sometimes in consonance with the dynastic framework of departure and arrival, sometimes in conflict with both or with one of them. They knew the instruments at their disposal and used them, and sometimes could, and did, use a range of languages even wider than their male counterparts. Some of them were successful, of course, some of them were less successful, but that was the same for the men. Third point, talking about seigniorial and princely authority, one also needs to investigate the complex interplay between family and power in a broader sense. In this context, exerting power is not only a matter of individuals, or not even a couple, but of groups, generations, and lineages. Furthermore, authority and power changed during the course of one's life and according to the position in which a woman or a man found themselves at a given moment of their lives. Some work has been done, of course. Punctual studies on this or that princess, especially for the 15th century. The 14th century is a bit of a terra incognita, have grown steadily over the last 20 years and constitute a useful critical mass from which to start. This research, thanks to an initial wide-ranging and articulated survey, let's say census probably, of the numerous cases that have been more or less investigated and their systematic analysis over a 2-century-long chronology, therefore has the ambition of proposing a paradigm shift from exception to rule. and studying the combined action of men and women as an everyday, constitutive, and constant element of the story of princely power in late Middle Ages and early Italian Renaissance. What's the frame? What's the timeline? Which are the sources? For the most part, central northern Italy had, since the Carolingian age, been imperial land, except for a strip of cities and territories that went from Perugia to Romagna, and that had become, over the centuries, of papal pertinence. Frederick I of Hohenzollern in 1183, Hohenstaufen, sorry, I'm dragged by my princesses, late medieval princesses, Hohenstaufen, of course. So Frederick I recognized to the communal cities in the imperial territory a consistent series of political autonomies, but they formally remained subject to the sovereign authority of the empire. The same form of subjection, albeit in different ways, bound the cities and lordships subject to the papacy to Rome. Between the 14th and the 15th centuries, these cities underwent a twofold transformation. On the one hand, some of them took a seigniorial configuration. They consistently passed to an autocratic type of governments in the hands of families that became true dynasties within a few decades. On the other, the geography of power dried up. Some cities, both seigniorial and republican, expanded territorially at the expense of others, which became, from autonomous that they were, dominated, while the main cities slowly assumed the characters of dominants or capitals, and they were the seat of courts. The authority of the Lord Princes of the 14th, 15th century Italy was then the result of a complex intertwining of factors. The dynasties that were to dominate the princely Italy of the early Renaissance based their control of one or more episcopal cities, their contadi et distretti, and of domains variously composed of rural and mountain communities and minor lordships, on a series of prerogatives of command and justice that the first generations of signori between the end of the 13th and the beginning of the 14th century were first delegated from below by the city through its councils and collegiate bodies, and then confirmed from above by the empire and the papacy. First, in the lifelong form of the vicariate, we will speak of lords, signori at this stage. That's why I'm always talking about signori, lords, and princes. And then in the 15th century, starting from the end of the 14th century, in the dynastic form of a marquisate or ducal title of imperial or later on papal rank. And we will speak of princes at this stage. That is, we are not dealing with monarchies or principalities of imperial origins with a long tradition of authority and legitimacy. We are, on the contrary, dealing with powers with a new juridical physiognomy and built on a fragile legitimacy. Within this large region, so central northern Italy, the geopolitical case studies I would like to take into account are many, because the seigniorial phenomenon had multiple facets, and because the 15th century or early 16th century outcomes represented in the 14th century only some of the possible futures. We don't need to think that 15th and early 16th century principalities were meant to be. There were many possibilities, and some of them were successful, some were not. So consideration will therefore be given to the lordships that were to become imperial principalities in the 15th century, of course, so Milan, Mantua, Ferrara, Urbino, but also to the 14th century lordships that were reabsorbed into the major dominions, the kingships of the Marca Trevigiana, such as della Scala, da Carrara, da Camino, or the families that were protagonists of the seigniorial episodes in Tuscany, Castracani, Donoratico, della Gherardesca. And the 15th century spicciolati, to use a Machiavellian word, poised between rural and castle lordships and urban lordships, from the seigniories, lordships of Romagna to the lineages of the Po Valley and the Apennines, which surfaced and resurfaced at every structural shake-up of the system until the early modern age, until mid-16th century. The research will also feature, where possible, the canto represented by the principalities of non-communal Italy, that is Savoy and all Monferrato, Savoy, Achaia, and the principalities of the valley of the Adige towards the empire, as well as the regimes that were not seigneurial or princely, but in their own way, deeply aristocratic and politically and sometimes dynastically involved in the affairs of the seigneurial part of the region, from Florence to Venice, from Genoa to Siena, from Lucca to Pisa. The choice to keep a broad view on the phenomenon is motivated also by the awareness that multiplicity concerned also roles in this system. The fluidity of the seigneurial and aristocratic landscape of late medieval Italy, in fact, makes it necessary to consider not only the female apex of this political society, that is, the signore, the marchioness, the duchesses, but also the others, the younger sisters, the cousins, the natural daughters of princes, and the daughters of minor lineages or urban aristocratic lineages, the wives of cadets and natural sons, often poised between becoming in turn ladies and princesses and remaining or becoming again only the female members of more or less articulate and higher rank courts. And of course, roles were multiple also during the lifetime of each princess: young bride and daughter-in-law, princess on her own right and wife, and then mother, widow, and or widow regent, all princess, Madama Vecchia, as they say in the 15th century, the mother of the prince. In my title today, another precision which is necessary, I allude in a provocative way to the Renaissance by aiming at going beyond it. Of course, it's a bit of a catching phrase, but there is a reason for it, which is more serious, I suppose. I hope. The chronology of my research intends to cover the period from the first decades of the 14th century to the first decades of the 16th century, in order to follow the structural transformation of the Italian seigneurial landscape in all its variety and all its changes over time. And these are, of course, exactly the decades that we define as the Italian Renaissance, early Renaissance in the European broader context, if you like. So why beyond that? The reason is the term Renaissance carries with it two famous statements from which I believe it is time to free ourselves, with all the consideration for their reasons. The first is related to the idea that women did not have a Renaissance. To quote a well-known and provocative essay by John Kelly, 1976, that was extremely important to open a debate on all this, but can be reconsidered right now. And this idea by John Kelly was taken up and articulated mainly for a Florentine context by many beautiful studies by Christiane Clapiche-Zuber, Le chiavi di Barba Blu, this idea that women in Renaissance Florence couldn't do anything and were closed out of the real power. The second, I mean, I don't believe it even for Florence, but for sure that's not the case for the North. The second statement concerns the weighty paradigm of exceptionalism, modeled on figures such as Isabella d'Este, Caterina Sforza Riario, Lucrezia Borgia, the great ladies of the Renaissance, luminous exceptions in a much duller landscape. Women so good that they were represented and behaved like men. Da virago, that's this idea. In other words, the episodes of female power that the tradition of late medieval and early Renaissance studies has handed down to us, magnifying from time to time the virago, the great lady, and imposing an irreparable opacity to all the others, are not individual and exceptional events, but the most well-known pieces of a system which was far more capillary. A last point should be made on which sources can we rely from this research, and I will cut here short because otherwise we will never end. The sources that are available for the 14th and 15th centuries are many and varied. The main problem is their consistency over time and over the different contexts. There are public sources, issued and preserved in seigneurial offices and chanceries, and private ones, notarial deeds, family and patrimonial records, inheritance, disputes, inventories. The 15th century sees a normalization of their production in significant quantities and the consolidation of their preservation, while the 14th century presents a more fragmented, less copious documentary landscape, in which the different documentary typologies are more meager compared to the very high rate of informativeness of their 15th century counterparts. Anyway, we still have many different typologies, and that's a very good thing because we can see many facets of the same phenomenon. So, what will be, in my hope, the structure of the book, which will be the different chapter or section or main themes? I apart from, of course, an introduction and historiographical discussion and all the likes that we used to do, but I would try to concentrate first to marriage networks and seigneurial and princely matrimonial mobility and strategies in the 14th and the 15th century, and through which we have a definition of dynastic power and all its networks. Then I will, of course, try to work on the nature of power exerted by women within the lordship and the principalities. And then I will try to focus on what I'm thinking of in a general way as the resources of seigneurial and princely women, putting into the term resources very different things, material and immaterial. And I will, and I'm very much looking forward to it, try to end this long story, but with some sort of overlook of spaces and images, that is, women's spatial and visual representation. Spaces such as palaces and gardens, studioli and monumental graves, chapels and monasteries, and images as portraits, frescoes, medals, miniatures in books, statues. I tell you immediately that this is the part that I haven't done yet, so no images. That's why I have no PowerPoint. I have no good images to show for now. So let's start with the first of these themes: marriage, kinship, and seigneurial networks. The first question that needs to be clarified is that of kinship structures and processes of dynastical strengthening. While these issues have been carefully studied for the early Middle Ages, there is a lack of systematic attention for these centuries to the mechanisms of marriage and the form, individual or collective, that seigneurial government takes and the consequences of these choices. In a landscape of high conflict intensity and low legitimation levels, matrimonial alliances were crucial to guarantee dynastic solidity and to build networks of relations. At the beginning of our period, so in early 14th century, the handling of authority was often collegial between groups of males, uncles and nephews, brothers, cousins, a mixture of all these combinations. Also fathers and sons, or grandfathers, sons and grandchildren. The result was an inner instability during the ruler's lifetime and many difficulties at the moment of a fatally unequal generational change. You can imagine, of all these guys had, of course, different lifetime expectations and speed. The multiplicity of potential holders of power in the 14th century, and for the 15th century, we have a relative frequency of natural heirs, or the coexistence, like in Ferrara, of natural and legitimate heirs with same kind of opportunities, multiplied the possible marriage combinations, making major and minor dynasties, aristocratic lineages of castle lords, and urban lineages of city signori, or aspiring or former urban signori linked to each other by a dense web of multi-generational marriage alliances. The political game in the 15th century was still open, as I said before. A recent collective research project focusing on the 14th century lordships that has surveyed the seigneurial experiments in northern and central Italy found that dozens of families or individuals held power over one or more episcopal cities for more or less long periods of time. Only decades of uninterrupted conflicts led to a very harsh selection of this family and the families and the consolidation of a few 15th century dynasties. This meant, from our point of view, that in the 14th century, marriage ties between families with a lordly vocation involved many aristocratic families, creating ties of kinship and client networks that would last for a long time. The still high mortality rate of males and females, or of war or childbirth or whatever, multiplied this frantic intertwining. In the 15th century, the process of consolidation of a few dynasties of princely rank disciplined the circuits of the matrimonial choices, but for the firstborns only, that both male and female, with some unusual choices and the broadening for all the princely families of the options on a regular European scale. We will come back to this. This meant, however, that the minor tiers of the aristocracies whose princely ambitions had been curtailed were allocated to the side branches of the main dynasties or to build up the courts of the major princesses. Marriage strategies, as always, had multiple consequences. On the one hand, they mobilized personal, familial, patrimonial, and cultural resources. On the other, of course, they were part of broad, multi-generational political strategies that could potentially have heavy consequences. Dynastic ties never really die and have a dangerous tendency to resurface again and again. And last but not least, the thickening of the matrimonial circuits and the reputation that went with wise or lucky choices helped in building, strengthening, and maintaining each center of seigniorial power, or for the unlucky or the unwise ones, in hampering, fragilizing, damning it. So the first thing I've thought of was to reconstruct these marriage circuits. Who were these women, who married whom and when, according to a simple enumeration criterion. So quite an erudite sort of search, which, by the way, it's anything but simple for many reasons. The variety of the available bibliography, the very frequent homonymy, the scarce reliability of ancient and 19th century genealogical repertories, the numbers of persons involved. The result, by now, are several hundreds of names, and I have not completed the survey yet, and a certain level of inaccuracy, of course. So no statistic, no quantitative approach whatsoever, but rather the attempt to identify some trends that could reveal themselves interesting enough to configure some underlying phenomenon. Let's try to see some of them. Many choices are unsurprisingly made within circles that are close, both geopolitically and in terms of rank and shared interests. In such cases, for example, in the 14th century, between Gonzaga, Este, Malatesta, Della Scala, da Carrara, Visconti, multi-generational crossings of brides are created, which in turn build and consolidate important mutual traditions, interests, and familiarity on all the levels you can imagine, from the political to the cultural to the economical and patrimonial. Considering the permanent or semi-permanent state of war of all those dynasties with each other, these ties became periodically crucial, both in the 14th and in the 15th century. There were also some tendencies, mainly of short or medium duration, to open different circuits. For example, in the 14th century, the introduction into the Visconti many branches in the decades 1330s, 1350s of brides coming from the great Genoese lineages with lordships and castles, Doria, Fieschi. Or again, marriage ties forged in the same years by the Po Valley lords with maidens born from non-Florentine Tuscan lineages, such as the Donoratico or the Della Gherardesca. In both cases, I think these were political explorations, attempts driven by the expansive impulse of some northern seigniories towards Tuscany and the Tyrrhenian Sea. But these marriages entailed the displacement of patrimonies and rights over land and people that then remained in the family and had to be managed. We will come back, if we'll have time, on some example of this. Another trend is the one towards marriages in different countries and cultures. When did the Italian signori and signore start thinking of foreign spouses for their sons and daughters, and why? And where were they looking for that? The answer is not linear, not surprisingly. In the second half of the 14th century, the eastern part of this region, the signori of the Veneto and the Marca Trevigiana, looked to imperial princes for their daughters, more rarely for their sons, probably because of Charles IV's southern expeditions and the intertwined interest of all the Marca Trevigiana with the imperial representatives. Afterwards, in the first decades of the 15th century, the Lords Princes looked closer to Italian dynasties, so by the end of the 14th and early 15th century. But then again, the Gonzaga in the 1430s started a spree of foreign spouses that was taken to the edge by the late Quattrocento dynastic constellation that involved the Aragonese of Naples and their Hungarian counterparts, and the Sforza, Este, and Gonzaga, mixing for the first time for the two lesser dynasties with royal blood. On the other hand, back to the 14th century, the Visconti, which were, of course, the highest of those families, had the 14th century episode of extreme broadening of the marriage networks with Bernabò and the Regina della Scala between the 1360s and 1380s. Their 9 daughters went on marrying a handful of European princes of German, French, and even English origin. They were not the first. Gian Galeazzo, which is the one who became duke in 1395, Gian Galeazzo's mother, Isabella of Valois, was of French royal blood, as he was his first wife, another Isabella of Valois. And one of his daughters, Valentina, married Louis d'Orléans, and that wedding was the event that prepared the ground for the 1494 French expedition in Italy with Charles VIII. So when I said dynastic ties never die, I mean also this kind of connections. When we talk about the power of these women, so we pass to the second big thing. What were the possible forms in which a share of seigneurial power was exercised by the ladies, princesses? Once again, the situation is quite complex. Let's try to clarify it at the risk, of course, of trivializing and banalizing. One premise must never be forgotten. The lords of these cities exercised a power over them that was still being defined, and not only or not so much vis-a-vis the respective sovereign authorities, so not above, but above all vis-a-vis of the complex political societies that they controlled or tried to control. A power that is whose concrete forms and limits in everyday governance as well as in ideological representation had to be defined on the basis of a series of previous instruments. I mean, I think of all the communal governments and innovative practices, and of a consistent, laborious conceptual creativity. I had to invent how to do this job. In this context, the relationship between men and women at the top of the lordship principality and their respective roles were also being defined. The wives of the 14th century lords and 15th century princes did not, in fact, have models to adapt to, but proceeded to define their own role and build up their own retinue, courts, households, governments, whatever, as the complementary role of their respective consorts grew and was defined. So it's really a process in the making. That said, there were 2 main regions in which a woman could exercise a more or less consistent and a more or less geographically or functionally defined fraction of personal power. As a woman, one could personally exercise public power framed in functions of direct government, jurisdiction, fiscality, administrative management of the domain, defense, even open warfare if necessary. Secondly, one could exercise more indirect and informal forms of power, which we could bring together under a general concept of soft power. We can deal about it later. The first form of power, the one that deals with an institutionalized form of authority and let women says, I order, or in my name, I want you to do something, was in turn exercised in various ways. The simplest, so to speak, is related to the power of regency. That is, the power held by the woman in the absence, temporary or permanent, of a male holder. For example, the classic example is in the case of minority heirs. Less frequent in the 14th century, when the often multiple management of the government made cases in which a woman was the only adult left, quite rare, but it happened. It was more frequent along the 15th century. We can have examples of this. Margherita Malatesta Gonzaga at the end of the 14th century, Bianca Maria Sforza Bona di Savoia in Milan in the 15th century, etc. Second form of this power referred to a formal delegation of functions. Formal. Let's see what I mean. Ruling functions as a whole and the titles that went with were sometimes attributed to a woman over a part of a dominion, not its entirety, never its entirety, as far as I know for now. A few examples are, again, in Milan, Regina della Scala in the early 1370s. She was vicaria of the city of Reggio on behalf of his husband, Bernabò. She had her seal, and he wrote to the Milanese officials in Reggio to write to her, not to him, and to obey everything she would order them. Or Bianca Maria Visconti in Cremona, her dotal city, a century later, she was confirmed as ruler on the death of Francesco Sforza, and Galeazzo Maria was already adult. He was already the duke, so it was not a minority period. And her autonomy was so real that at the height of her contrasts with her son Galeazzo, letters from Bianca Maria showed her intention to negotiate the ending of Cremona to Venice, that is, the eternal enemy. The third and most common form of female power was well defined by the concept of power sharing. I remember a beautiful book by Sarah Cochran about Francesco Gonzaga and Isabella d'Este about this idea of power sharing. Of course, formally, and in most cases, it was the Lord who was the source of legitimate and normative authority. The framework, language, and imagery of political decision-making were formally and normatively made. Having said that, the government of the domain, especially, I believe, in the 15th century, when the power of many rulers became the power of the princely couple, on obvious royal imitation, they were just trying to figure out how to represent themselves as a couple, was in fact daily, under certain conditions, a shared government between the prince and his wife. Specifying under certain conditions is necessary, of course, but it's not restrictive of the quality of female government action. Such conditions were, in fact, quite frequent and were reduced to the physical absence of the prince for whatever reason, hunting, war, pilgrimage, politics, from the deliberating center of power, or to his functional absence, when for precise and sometimes even occasional reasons, a specific function, for instance, diplomacy, was systematically performed by a princess. The balance between the two, the prince and the princess, that depended very much on the context, the mutual understanding, nature, age, condition, education, and temperament of one and the other. What must be considered, however, is that a male government could be put into practice with regularity by a woman that was service the machinery of government, understood as both formal practices and informal circuits, moved in an ordinary way. There has been a very, very interesting book on Eleonora of Aragon, Duchess of Ferrara, recently written by Valentina Prisco, who worked on Eleonora's correspondences. And you may see that she did everything from preceding the councils of justice, taking care of the fiscal distribution of taxes, defending the market rate and the duty if needed. Second mode of exercising concrete power is what I have called soft power, implanting a contemporary definition. It is that of the construction of female relational networks at the apex of seigniorial power. These women, in fact, in defining their own role in the process of constructing an increasingly normatively certain and dynastically linear, so legitimation and dynastical linearity, no problems of divisions between hers, seigniorial power, built around themselves network of relations conducted and maintained through mechanism of exchanges, gifts, letters, resources. These relational networks were both with men and with women. They were slightly different between them. They were similar in forms, but different in themes and tones. And we know a lot of them, particularly for the 15th century, because of the wealth of the records. On one side, records like graces, degrees, concessions. On the other, sources like correspondences. In particular,
by the egg rolls, because they smell like cat.
Sorry?
Yeah.
Sorry?
I think someone accidentally unmuted themselves.
Okay, no problem. Okay, let's go. I thought, oh, I said something wrong. No, I was talking about relational networks. Again, we don't have the time, maybe in the discussion, but that has been studied for some of those princesses, Bianca Maria Visconti, Barbara di Brandeburgo, Isabella d'Este herself in the 15th century. 14th century is still, there is still a lot of work to do. Two further elements can help us today to complete, if time remains, this rapid synthesis of the nature and forms of female power. The first, what I called in general resources. The first relates to the culture of these ladies, the second to the economic base on which they could count. Let us start with culture, meaning the term in the broadest sense of literacy and familiarity with texts and writings. We know a great deal about the humanist pedagogy and the importance that princely education had in the 15th century, both with individual tutors or with experiments with educational institutions like Vittorino da Feltre's Ca' Zoiosa in Mantova. And we know that also the princesses, the young princesses, were educated like their brothers and together with them. They studied history, Latin, rhetoric, oratory, grammatica, music, and they learned to write by their own hands. We know far less about the education of women in the lordly courts of the 14th century, although on closer inspections, some indications of their familiarity with reading and writing with Latin and the vernacular emerge from their correspondence. These women knew Latin. The brides of the lords had to deal with letters and deeds in Latin on a daily basis. Of course, it was probably more the notarial and medieval Latin than the humanistic one, even though we start to know more about aristocrats with intellectual propensities at the end of the 14th century. However, with a few rare exceptions, these women were not in the full sense literate, as Dante told us. And they were not familiar enough with Latin to feel comfortable writing it in their own hand. As far as orthography is concerned, that is, the ability to write in one's hand, if for the 15th century such an ability is clear, for the 14th century, in the relative scarcity of letters in general, male and female, mainly for preservation reasons, evidence of women's personal writing is even rarer. That are, however, a few instances of princesses and ladies who knew how to write, and also not only daughters of lords, but also women of the elite can be seen taking pen in hand. 14th century correspondences have some peculiar characteristics. They are mostly in Latin, they are drier, more concrete, and shorter writings than later equivalents, but they do testify to a very dense and capillary network of relations, even if compared with the male ones. They were letters with, in our eyes, most formulaic content based of a simple structure, but they were meant to discuss dynastic, familiar, political, economic interest, and maintain a level of familiarity among all those women that were close together by family ties, alive. The 15th century introduced qualitative and quantitative changes to both the formal and the substantial framework of these letters, but their function, the function of using a written medium to express personal and public relations of power, remained the same. Sophisticated literacy allowed 15th century princesses to deal with a culture of writing that was building increasingly complicated systems of both political discourses and governmental records. Through letter writing, a woman like Isabella d'Este controlled the machinery of administration and government, and the whole network of the Gonzaga and Este dynastic friends and foes, subjects and allies, both male and female. And women in the 15th century, as Isabella d'Este in the early 16th, but also before, we know that they played with their capacity of writing with their own hands. Subscribing, writing parts of the letters, writing all of the letters in a complicated graduation of familiarity and intentionality. Second and last element that interests us today in this field of resources is the patrimonial profile that defines these ladies, princesses. Wealth, landed wealth, economic, jurisdictional, and fiscal rights on people, mobile wealth, jewelry, silverware, luxury fabrics, and clothes, was more than a mark of status or even an insurance on the women's personal security. It was an asset for the lordship and the principality, and an accumulative patrimony available to the lordship principalities to be invested over the generation, to solve financial problems, finally to feed the countless chains of exchange and rewards that built internal consensus. Princely brides brought this wealth with them in two forms, as a dowry, as an inheritance. They could then strengthen and enlarge it thanks to concessions from their husbands or their male relatives. The management of these resources created opportunities, but also had the potential to cause problems, endless disputes over the generations, or even conflicts, wars, like when Regina della Scala wanted back some of her lands in Verona, and Bernabo declared war to the Scaligeri, the laws of Verona, to get them back, generation after generation. In other words, it significantly influenced the stability of the incoming principality and the relationships between the families of the groom and the bride, and their often innumerable and sometimes unexpected descendants. There are pretensions that resurface after 2 or 3 generations. So dowries. Upon marriage, these young women received a dowry, sometimes of a very considerable size. And as early as the 14th century, it was mobile wealth, cash, jewelry, money invested in financial institutions such as the Camera degli Imprestiti in Venice. As a guarantee for the dowry assets, the husband gave a donatio propter nuptias, that is, they assigned to their wives the equivalent of the dowry, in most cases represented by land, a city, a collection of villages and castles, a micro-region, from which she derived income, of course, but also over which she had power. During the 15th century, this practice was transformed in the sense that no longer were cities, towns, castles of village entrusted, but large estates. In other words, there was a tendency to make the donatio a purely patrimonial fact, removing the previous ambiguity of mixing lands and rights. Once dowager, the princess had to negotiate her own patrimonial position within the dynasty according to context, age, and heirs. The payment of these sums in many cases dragged on for years or decades, and sometimes the fact that two spouses from the same dynasty came to the same dynasty with some decades of difference, complicated rather than simplified the thing, because the two problems were overlap. There were cases in which biological chance led to exceptional situation, especially in the 14th century, and I'm alluding here to the means of inheritance. When kinship structures had not yet tightened nor developed mechanism to protect the central hereditary axis also from a patrimonial point of view, women could then find themselves the sole remaining heirs of huge seigneurial estates, and the consequences were endless disputes with all the male and female relatives of the lineages of a rival. But these are half a province. I mean, the Dadovara, della Gherardesca that went to Mantova or to Milan carried with them really whole of Cremona or Brescia or whatever, or something like that. There were also other forms of economic power available to these women. They could find themselves in control of more or less extensive landed estates that derived from assignments of various kind, with a wide range of rights attached. Again, Regina della Scala was given in successive waves different lands by Bernabò over the courses of a decade in a particular area of the Brescia region, the Calciana, and the Brescia bank of the river Oglio. And again, he gave her the lands and the right, merum et mixtum imperium et gladi potestatem, and the right to constituere et deputare vicarios et rectores. So again, mixing political and patrimonial level. This kind of concessions drop in the 15th century, but really there is a full research to be carried on. Chiara Barbero, who works on Anne of Cyprus, Duchess of Savoy, in the 1450s, says that Lusignan was given a number of castellanies by her husband Ludovico, and here too, in addition to patrimonial and tax revenues, that was the power to appoint officials. So there are much work to do, actually. These were low-risk operations for the patrilineal axis of the kinship dynasty, because these are assets within their control. What is also certain, however, is that these operations gave to the princess, in the moment in which she was alive, a concrete power over a fraction of the domain. And I conclude. The signore and princesses discussed here were familiar in a structural way with power, authority, and governance. They exercised political functions, controlling network of allegiance and friendship, as well as kinship, and held titles of authority not only as regent in cases of minority or illness of consorts, sons, brothers, but also on many occasions in the presence of them. They managed the day-to-day practices and functions of government. They presided over councils, delegated administrative tasks to officials and magistracies, inspected borders and fortresses, maintained diplomatic relations not necessarily linked on dynastic relations alone, managed daily correspondence, and had their own seals, the formal instruments of authority. They built and nurtured a dense network of family and dynastic connections, making possible through their presence at the heart of the power of this or that princely body, territorial projections and diplomatic alliances, and at the same time controlled transversal conflict and direct clashes through their presence alone. If you think to the two sisters, Beatrice d'Este and Isabella d'Este, who were the daughters of Ercole of Este and Eleonora of Aragon, and the wives of Ludovico Sforza and Francesco Gonzaga in the years preceding the descent of Charles VIII into Italy, they were the ones who kept together three very, sometimes very different and powerful men, a father and two husbands. They managed, maintained, handed down, lost and recovered great dynastic and personal patrimonies, goods and lands, but also jurisdictions and rights over men and women. as the legal framework regulating marriages and the transmission of inheritance changed, and as the models of life cycle, mortality, and age of marriage of the great aristocratic kinships changed as well. They finally elaborated particular declinations, sometimes aligned, sometimes subversive, of the cultural representations and political languages, ritual, figurative, textual, spiritual, of their age. This sharing of power, authority, and government in all its declination is revealed at different times and in different ways, and becomes increasingly perceptible as records from accounts book to degrees, from inventories to court records, from notarial deeds to correspondence, multiply and become more eloquent. But I'm increasingly believe in this, a structural feature of seigneurial power as it is constructed. It has a long story, a story as long as the story of the power itself. Thank you very much. Sorry if I've been too long.
No, that was fascinating. I think as a timekeeper, I always have this tension of like, oh, I should keep time, but I'm interested. And so, yeah, I thought that whole thing was so fascinating. And so for questions, if people have questions, you can raise your hand in the little reactions panel, or if you're in a place where you don't want to turn on your camera, you can put them in the chat. And I'll read them out. I'm going to use my power as chair to ask you the first question. And I thought this was so interesting. And while you were speaking, I pulled up my syllabus for my Italian Renaissance class, and I was like, oh, I need to change this. Oh, I need to change this. And so my question for you is about the sort of historiographical stakes of the project. And as you were talking, I was thinking a lot about the new diplomatic history, where your own work and others have really emphasized the importance of informal diplomacy rather than just the ambassador and the speech, and also the new work on political communication that has sort of expanded our sense of the political body and what even counts as politics. So I'm generally interested in how you see your work fitting into this larger scholarship, and then very specifically, I was fascinated by, as you were talking about the difference between informal and soft power, and then formal, or I guess hard power. And I'm wondering how you would see that undermining the older idea of public versus private. It's sort of a public world of Renaissance oratory and formal hard governance versus a private world of women's influence, because in my listening to you seem to be really undermining that idea of a binary of public and private.
Yes, thank you. These are true questions, actually. I will start from the beginning. I'm not a gender historian. I'm a political historian. So I started studying this kind of power at the beginning of my career, and also diplomacy. When I started thinking of it, of course, I started from this idea of having the building of from permanent embassies, professionality, and whatever. I think that in many ways, recent research on the state, on politics, on diplomacy has not only nuanced, but undermined this idea, and this is your second question that comes into play, between public and private, between a power meant as an institutionalized, formalized power, and all the rest. I don't think there is this distinction. I think that for this age, there is a sort of continuity of instruments, of expectations, of agents. Of course, there were things that women couldn't do. They couldn't go to university, they couldn't hold public offices. But public offices were not the state or not the politics, not only that. So as we reconsidered diplomacy and put on central stage the many ways of having a diplomatic agency, we can do the same for women's power as well. And in this sense, I mean, I don't like the idea. I like the idea of the soft power, of course. Of course, it's obvious in a sense, because these women were working on informal instruments like giving graces or asking and pleading with their husbands to favor one man over the other, one woman over the other. But they were also doing something different. They were governing, and that's something we didn't see, at least not in Italy. I mean, when you listen to scholars working on Iberian queens, you have a completely different picture. You see these women just doing things and governing and ruling and exerting. So, of course, in Italy, we have lordships, low-level nobility, the difficulty of building a princely power, but they were doing more or less the same. They were, if you look at the correspondences, Regina della Scala, and I'm not talking about the 15th century, I'm talking about the 14th century, that hasn't been worked on at all on this from this point of view. If you look to a woman like Regina della Scala, which is famous because she was bigger than life, and she's painted in nel Cappellone degli Spagnoli in Florence, side by side with Bernabò, in full majesty, exactly like him. He is before Giovanna, John II, and the Ladislao of Durazzo monumental grave, just 30, maybe 40 years before. So when you look at these women, you see that they were writing, they were exerting governing powers. So I would like to go a bit beyond or farther to this distinction, because it doesn't give us an image that is adapted to this period, to this kind of power. I'm not sure I've answered, but
No, that's
the two
I
questions
could go on
were...
forever, but yeah, that's really interesting. Thank you. Noah, you have a question.
I have a question.
Yes, hello. This was